Why are so many more Ukrainian bodies being returned than Russian ones? Since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022, Russia and Ukraine have repeatedly returned the remains of fallen soldiers to one another. At the beginning, some of these operations were relatively balanced. In June 2022, one of the first major transfers involved 160 sets of remains from each side. Later, however, the pattern changed. By the 16th of July 2026, Ukraine's coordination headquarters had reported that 24,805 bodies had been repatriated before that day's transfer. The 501 bodies announced later on the 16th brought the reported running total to 25,306, more than 25,000. In some individual transfers, Russia returned around 1,000 sets of remains which, according to the Russian side, might belong to Ukrainian servicemen, while Russian officials reported receiving only a few dozen presumed Russian soldiers. During a large repatriation operation in June 2025, Ukraine received 6,057 sets of human remains. Russia reported receiving 78. In another transfer on the 16th of July, 2026, Ukraine said it had received 501 bodies, which according to the Russian side might belong to Ukrainian servicemen. A Russian lawmaker involved in the process said Russia received 31. The imbalance is enormous. So what does it mean? Does it prove that Ukraine has lost many more soldiers than Russia? Or can the difference be explained by battlefield geography, evacuation practices, delayed identification, and the timing of the transfers? The honest answer is that these repatriations cannot provide a complete casualty count, but it would also be premature to assume that such a large and persistent imbalance tells us nothing about relative losses. To understand the issue, we first need to establish what is actually being measured. A body returned by Russia is not a random Ukrainian soldier selected from all Ukrainian fatalities. It is a person whose remains came into Russian possession. Likewise, a Russian body returned by Ukraine is normally a person whose remains came into Ukrainian possession. Most soldiers killed on territory controlled by their own army are recovered by that army. They never enter the cross-line repatriation system. This means that the number of bodies held by the opposing side depends on at least 4 different factors. The first is the total number of soldiers killed. The second is which side controlled the location after the battle. The third is whether the soldier's own unit was able to recover the body. The fourth is when the opposing side decided, or was able, to return the remains. This distinction is crucial. Imagine that Russian forces lose 100 soldiers while attacking a Ukrainian position. Ukraine loses 40 while defending it. If Russia eventually captures the position, it may recover most of its own 100 dead during and after the battle. At the same time, it may find 20 or 30 Ukrainian bodies that could not be evacuated during the retreat. A later transfer might therefore show 30 Ukrainian bodies and only a handful of Russian bodies, even though Russia lost more soldiers in the battle. This is the strongest argument against treating the repatriation ratio as the casualty ratio. For much of 2024 and 2025, Russian forces advanced slowly across heavily fortified Ukrainian positions. These advances included places such as Avdiivka, Vuhledar, and numerous smaller settlements, trenches, tree lines, and defensive strongpoints. Russian forces could recover many of their own dead while the fighting continued. After taking a position, they could also recover Ukrainian soldiers who had remained behind. The remains could then be stored for months and returned in one large batch. This helps explain why a transfer on a particular date may include people killed in different regions and in different years. The June 2025 operation is an important example. It was not an exchange of everyone killed during the previous week. It was a multi-day transfer of a large accumulated collection of remains under an agreement reached in Istanbul. However, battlefield control cannot be the entire explanation. Russia also conducted several major withdrawals. In the spring of 2022, Russian forces withdrew from the areas around Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy. Ukraine collected hundreds of Russian bodies from those areas. Some were placed in refrigerated railway cars while arrangements for their return were discussed. In September 2022, Russian forces rapidly withdrew from a large part of the Kharkiv region. Ukraine captured soldiers, military equipment, and territory. Russian bodies were also recovered in areas that returned to Ukrainian control. Later that year, Russia withdrew from the western bank of the Dnipro River and from the city of Kherson. The Kherson withdrawal was more organized and provided more time to remove equipment, wounded soldiers, and bodies. But the general point remains. Russia has not controlled every battlefield throughout the war. Ukraine has also conducted major offensives and recovered territory. It therefore had opportunities to collect Russian bodies. This is why the simple statement that Russia returns more bodies only because Russia always controls the battlefield is incomplete. The real question is quantitative. How much greater is the probability that a dead Ukrainian soldier enters Russian possession than the probability that a dead Russian soldier enters Ukrainian possession? Suppose, for the sake of argument, that Russia has lost 3 times as many soldiers as Ukraine. If Russia still returns 20 times more bodies than it receives, then a dead Ukrainian soldier would have to enter Russian possession approximately 60 times more often than a dead Russian soldier enters Ukrainian possession. The calculation is simple. The observed transfer ratio equals the fatality ratio multiplied by the relative probability of the opposing side recovering the body. That 60-to-1 difference is mathematically possible. During a particular retreat, collapse, or encirclement, the difference could be even greater. But across the entire war, including the Russian withdrawals from northern Ukraine, the Kharkiv region, and Kherson, a difference of 60-to-1 would be a very strong assumption. It would need evidence. It cannot simply be taken for granted. The imbalance in body transfers therefore creates an additional empirical burden for estimates claiming that Russian fatalities are 3 or 4 times higher than Ukrainian fatalities. Such estimates may still be correct. The transfer data do not refute them. But they require an extremely large and persistent difference in battlefield recovery rates. That difference has not been measured publicly. Another factor is firepower. Russia has generally possessed more artillery ammunition, more aircraft, more missiles, and a much greater capacity to use heavy glide bombs. In later phases of the war, Russian attack drones, artillery, and glide bombs increasingly threatened not only frontline positions, but also roads, rotation routes, medical evacuation teams, and supply lines behind the front. This can produce casualties without rapid movement on the map. It can also prevent the recovery of the wounded and the dead. A soldier may be killed in a position that is technically still under Ukrainian control, but reaching that position may be impossible because it is continuously watched by drones and covered by artillery. If the area is captured weeks later, the remains may then enter Russian possession. At the same time, Russia has spent much of the war conducting offensive operations. Attacking prepared positions can be extremely costly. Russian assault groups have repeatedly crossed mined and observed terrain under Ukrainian artillery and drone fire. Russian superiority in heavy weapons therefore does not automatically mean lower Russian casualties. Both things can be true at the same time. Russia may lose large numbers of soldiers in assault operations, while Ukraine also suffers heavy losses from Russian firepower and unsuccessful withdrawals. The missing are another major part of the problem. Large numbers of Ukrainian service members have been listed as missing at different stages of the war. The wider tracing system also contains civilians and cases from both sides. In May 2025, the International Committee of the Red Cross said it held 126,000 open cases reported by families on both sides. But a missing person register is not a register of the dead. It can include soldiers who were captured, wounded, and separated from their units, admitted to hospitals under incomplete information, absent from their units, counted twice, or later found alive. It also includes soldiers whose bodies were recovered, but have not yet been identified. Some of the missing are likely dead, but no responsible analysis can simply add every missing person to the death toll. The same problem exists on the Russian side. Russian families have also submitted large numbers of requests and genetic samples while trying to locate missing servicemen. The Russian system is less transparent, making precise comparison difficult. Prisoners of war provide another indirect indicator. Russia appears to have held more Ukrainian prisoners at several stages, although complete and directly comparable inventories are not public. The surrender of the Mariupol garrison was especially important. Ukraine, however, also captured significant numbers of Russian soldiers during the Kharkiv offensive, the Kursk operation, and numerous smaller engagements. Prisoner numbers can tell us something about encirclements, withdrawals, and battlefield initiative, but they cannot be converted directly into the number of dead. Identification creates further uncertainty. Ukrainian authorities do not automatically declare every returned body to be a confirmed Ukrainian soldier. Their usual wording is that the remains, according to the Russian side, may belong to Ukrainian servicemen. Genetic testing and forensic examination follow. Some bags contain fragments from more than one person. Different parts of the same person may arrive separately, sometimes in different transfers. Documents found beside a body may belong to somebody else. Ukraine has also reported finding a limited number of Russian soldiers among remains presented as Ukrainian. Russia has disputed some of these claims. These errors matter, but the documented misclassification cases so far are too few to explain an imbalance of many thousands. There is also the problem of timing. The two sides do not necessarily empty all of their storage facilities during every transfer. One side may return a large accumulated batch, while the other returns only the remains prepared for that particular operation. The terms and timing are negotiated separately. This means that a single exchange can be deeply misleading. But when the imbalance continues, across many transfers and several years, an explanation based only on timing becomes less convincing. Source bias must also be considered. The Russian government has an obvious interest in minimizing Russian losses and emphasizing Ukrainian losses. The Ukrainian government has the opposite interest. Western governments and organizations supporting Ukraine also have political and strategic interests. Russian opposition publications may use real documents and public records while still having a clear anti-Kremlin position. A politically biased source can publish genuine information. It can also choose assumptions, comparisons, and headlines that support its political position. A source should therefore not be accepted or rejected only because of its label. The raw evidence and the interpretation must be separated. A named obituary, a cemetery record, a court decision, or an inheritance case can be checked individually. A model that takes a partial list and estimates the complete death toll is much less certain. Its result depends on assumptions about missing records, delays, duplication, and how representative the available sample is. This applies to estimates of both Russian and Ukrainian losses. So what can reasonably be concluded? First, the repatriation ratio is not the casualty ratio. It would be wrong to say that because Russia returned 20 times more bodies, Ukraine must have lost 20 times more soldiers. Second, the imbalance is too large and too persistent to dismiss. It adds weight to the view that Ukrainian military fatalities are higher than older, low-end public acknowledgement suggested. It also shows the scale of the forensic and identification burden that remains unresolved. Third, the imbalance does not disprove claims that Russia has lost 3 or 4 soldiers for every Ukrainian soldier killed. But it does make those claims depend on a very large difference in the probability that bodies enter the opposing side's possession. That may happen in particular operations. It is much harder to assume across the entire war without detailed evidence. Fourth, it remains possible that Russia has suffered more military deaths overall. Russia has conducted more assault operations, has accepted heavy losses, and has a much larger population from which to recruit. But the available evidence does not allow a precise and politically neutral ratio. The true balance may be closer to parity than the most one-sided public estimates suggest. Russia may have lost more. The losses may be relatively close. Ukraine may have suffered higher fatalities during particular periods. At present, none of these possibilities can be established from body transfers alone. The most defensible conclusion is therefore limited, but important. The extraordinary imbalance in returned remains is not proof that Ukraine has lost more soldiers overall, but it is strong evidence that Ukrainian losses have been severe, that the identification process remains incomplete, and that confident claims of an overwhelming Russian disadvantage should be treated with caution. The transfers do not reveal the final answer, but they change the range of answers that can reasonably be believed.